Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel, and it's been a while. I took a little hiatus to work on a novella called Reflex Forager, which may or may not be the final title of it. It is a side quest for Alex and Marcus, who are the protagonists in Graveyard Shift. And it's not a prequel, not a sequel. It's just like another adventure involving these same characters. And I'm having a lot of fun with it, and we'll see where it goes. And I will release more news about that as we get some news about that. Right now, there's not a whole lot going on. So an interesting thing happened this weekend. It's about 10:30 at night right now, and I can't stop thinking about it. So I just figured after I got a couple of requests through social media that I should do a QFD episode about it, I decided, oh, what the heck? I'm already just kind of obsessing about it and can't get any other work done. So might as well record an episode. And what happened this weekend is I saw a little film. You might have heard of it. It's called Joker.
Skybird, this is Dropkick with a red dash alpha message in 2 parts. Break.
5, 4, 3. Hands on keys, turn. Okay, so before we get going, I have to warn everybody. There's going to be spoilers. I'm going to be discussing the film and what I think about it and what it meant to me. And if you have not seen this film, you will be doing yourself a grave disservice if you listen to this before seeing the movie. I would recommend definitely seeing the film first, and then maybe listening to this and then seeing it again. See if you catch some of the same things I saw. But there's going to be a lot of spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, just bail out now. This podcast will be around. It'll be up. And so you can just revisit it after you've seen the film. And if you have no intention of seeing the film at all, and there are people out there, and we'll get to that in a little bit, that have no intention of seeing the film ever, right? I would recommend against that, but then again, you might not be the target audience. This movie is not for everybody. So if you think you don't want to see the movie, but you're interested, then go ahead and listen. But I'm not going to try to convince you to see the film. I'm just telling it kind of how it is, and it's gonna have spoilers. I'm not going to talk around them. So. I'm assuming that if you're still listening to the cast here, that you have seen the film and or don't care about spoilers. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed. So yeah, I saw Joker. For the record, and we'll get this right out of the way, I think it is probably the best film of the year so far. Joaquin Phoenix's performance is incredible. I don't fully understand how that guy can put himself through that kind of trial, both physically and mentally, and deliver a performance like that. I mean, that's why he is a movie star. He is one of the best in the industry, and this movie showcases why. Regardless of whether people think it's a good film or a bad film, it is a film that will be talked about for a long time. And you'll note that I'm using the term film and not movie. This is a personal thing of mine. I think a movie's it's like the difference between a movie and a film for me is that a film's primary purpose is art and a movie's primary purpose is entertainment. And that's a loose definition. Sometimes they transcend each other. You can definitely have art that is highly entertaining. You can have movies that rise to the form of art. So it's just a way that I categorize things in my head. And this definitely falls into the realm of film. Is it entertaining? Absolutely. And it is a comic book film, which is so hard to actually parse when I think about this, because the comic book elements are so ingrained in it and just kind of glossed over that this could have been a film that had nothing to do with comics at all, and it still would stand on its own and be completely excellent. And there's a lot of criticisms out there. As of right now, at the time of this recording, it's up on Rotten Tomatoes. It has a 69% critic score and a 91% audience score. And the critic score, Rotten Tomatoes in very recent times has undertaken some really disingenuous practices in who they solicit to put in a critic score. Most notably was the Dave Chappelle special, where they particularly targeted certain critics so that the special would get a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, and then they withheld the audience score for, I think it was about a week, so that people couldn't see that. And I think it's in the high 90s right now for the audience score. So there was definitely an agenda at play, and unfortunately that seems to be the case across the board nowadays. Regardless of anything you want to talk about, there is an agenda in play, and the media is complicit, and they are going to skew things to serve that agenda. And Joker is no exception. And so we're going to have to talk about that. But I don't want to get started with that. I want to start just talking about how really they don't make films like this anymore. And it is kind of a smaller character study. I've heard different figures for the budget, 35 million, 55 million. In any case, compare that to any of the new comic book films. You know, I think they just start at 100 million. I don't think you ever make a comic book film for less than that, right? Having said that, this is not, a lot of the folks that I've spoken to who have seen the film and were disappointed went into it expecting something akin to The Dark Knight, in the sense that they wanted to see the clown prince of crime with no Batman to rein him in and just seeding chaos throughout Gotham City. And it's not that you don't see that. It's that that's not the thrust of the film, and that's not what you don't see it in the way that you would in, say, The Dark Knight. This is very much a character study. It is a smaller film. It is, in many ways, just a performance vehicle for Joaquin Phoenix to deliver, I think, the performance of his career. It's actually very incredible. It is a derivative film, and because of the time that it's set, it's going to be compared to a lot of other things. It is set in 1981 in Gotham City, which I think it was pretty much exclusively filmed in New York City and maybe some Jersey City, but from what I saw, it was like Brooklyn and around basically like some parts in Manhattan and stuff like that too. So it's New York City standing in for Gotham, and it is a 1981 New York City. Now, right away, it starts to chip at things that are going on in 2019. Immediately, one of the first things you hear is a news report. Oh, and just as a quick aside, Warner Brothers uses their old logo from the 80s when the movie comes up. So it's kind of a nice touch, you know. One of the first things you hear is a newscast talking about how there is a garbage strike and the garbage is piling up all around the city and it's creating all these problems, and there's like super rats running around, these giant rats running around, and there's concerns about typhoid fever breaking out. Now, though that very much could be ripped from the headlines of 2019, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and actually New York. If I'm not mistaken, New York is having a garbage problem right now. Los Angeles has a noted homeless problem and crisis going on, to which like some medieval diseases are showing back up, where typhus is one of them. They were talking about bubonic plague, and they're even concerned about leprosy. And San Francisco has like such a problem with like human feces and needles and stuff that they've had to enable a special task force to go and clean this stuff up. So right away, you're like, there's parallels to 2019, like immediately. And the movie does not shy away from that at all. In fact, I think that's kind of its purpose. And director Todd Phillips, who, if you don't know, was actually known for Old School and like The Hangover and some kind of raunch comedies and stuff like that beforehand. I have like a theory that I talked to my wife about where when David Fincher came out with Seven, the movie he had made before that was Alien 3, and then he couldn't get work for a while. And because Alien 3 was so poorly received, and it's not entirely his fault. There's a whole gamut of issues with Alien 3, but he comes out and he drops Seven, and it was just so full of angst and nihilism and everything. And this is kind of Todd Phillips' Seven, I would say. This is his, okay, society, this is what I think, and I'm not going to hold back, and you guys have to listen. So earlier I said it was a derivative film, and it is, and not just derived from, say, the comic book material. I will confess straight away, I am not a huge Batman fan as far as like the comics go. As far as the big stories, The Killing Joke, The Dark Knight, stuff like that, I've read all that stuff. But I am very much a Marvel and not a DC when it comes to collecting comics. So I don't keep up on Batman all that much. But from what I saw, there was only a couple of components from this film that were taken from the comics. The idea of Joker being a failed stand-up comic. I think that comes from The Killing Joke. And there is a whole talk show appearance that is in the end of the third act, the climax of the film, actually, that seems taken beat for beat from The Dark Knight, but then they changed quite a bit of it. So there's like no laughing gas, there's no like poisoned lipstick and stuff like that from the comic. But otherwise, it kind of follows that very, very closely. The other reason I say it's a derivative film, and Todd Phillips fully owns up to this, is that it is an homage of really two films, Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. King of Comedy actually starred Robert De Niro, so throwing him in this is definitely a nod to that. But there's also other influences in there. Psycho, for sure. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And for me, the first time I saw the film, and yes, I have seen it twice in the same weekend. The first time I saw the film, I walked out of there and I said, the last time I saw a film like that was Fight Club. And it really, really did remind me of Fight Club and the messages behind that, with like Project Mayhem and all this stuff that was going on and the kind of movement. Direction-wise, it looks and feels like something Martin Scorsese would have shot maybe 15, 20, maybe even 30 years ago. And so it is very heavily influenced by Martin Scorsese, even though, as far as I know, he had nothing to do with it. But when you think about the two movies that are influencing this, Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, those are Scorsese films. So because Todd Phillips is mining from those, then it's obviously going to have his fingerprints all over it. He's kind of imitating his style a little bit too. And so like right away you're confronted with like, hey, an idea like, is this a movie for everyone? And the immediate answer is no. And like I said before, if you're expecting something like The Dark Knight, you're not going to get it. You're going to be, a lot of people have said that they were bored, that it was too slow, that it didn't, that they seemed that they didn't like it, that there was not enough action and stuff like that. Well, it's not that kind of movie. So I would say it's not a film for everyone, but it's a film to everyone. Because some of the themes that this movie carries, the main one I would say is that society needs to take responsibility for the monsters it creates. That's probably the central theme of the movie, and that people need to be nice to one another. That's another message that goes all the way through the film, and you wonder what would have happened if somebody had given Arthur Fleck a hug at any point in the movie, right? Would things have turned out differently? And probably not, but who knows, right? And so that has come with a certain amount of controversy, right? So before the film even opened, it had screened at the Venice Film Festival, and it got like a standing ovation, and everyone liked it. Then we started hearing that this was a movie that celebrated incels and that it was a dangerous film full of radical ideas and celebrating the wrong values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the scolds came out of the woodwork to attack this thing, right? And they started talking about how, it's going to cause violence, it's going to do this and that, and et cetera. And then when the film hits, there are articles out there, which I'll cover very briefly, that want the film to fail. They're attacking the film on its opening weekend, which we all know that's the most important weekend for any Hollywood film. And there's a couple articles out there. I'm not going to mention the guy's name because I think he's a tool. Titled, "You Shouldn't See the Joker This Weekend." And this guy admits in the article, right, that he will not see the movie. He refuses to see the movie because it celebrates the wrong kinds of ideas. And I'm like, okay. And he's not the only one who's written an article like this. There's a lot of people that have. And this is endemic of a larger problem where people don't even want to be faced with certain narratives because it might make them uncomfortable, right? So they try canceling stories before they can even happen or see them. And it's a coward's way. And I would call this guy, to his face, Ellsworth Toohey. Now, Ellsworth Toohey is a character in a novel by Ayn Rand called The Fountainhead. And he's the principal villain. And he is a critic. That's what he does. And because he's a very powerful and influential critic, he can make or break people just by writing an article and saying, this is good, this is bad. But he's very much into canceling people that, in the novel, that don't toe the line. That go off and do things on their own. And when they don't toe the line, they throw out, Ellsworth Toohey throws out this article that will savage this person and destroy their lives. And it's a hypocritical way of doing things, right? But unfortunately, that seems to be what's going on in a lot of media nowadays with cancel culture and all kinds of stuff like that. If somebody is guilty of wrongthink, if I'm going to mix literary metaphors, then they cancel that person, or at least try to damage them in as much as they can. And this is not the first film I can think of this happening to. Recently, this is a couple years back, there was a science fiction film called Passengers. And it had some pretty serious controversy to it, but that was like the point of the film. That was the plot of the film. And there was an op-ed piece that came out and people refused to see that movie just because somehow if they supported the film, that was somehow like supporting the act that the film showed. And that is absolutely not the case. And it seems to be that people are drawing the conclusion that if people see Joker, we're somehow encouraging this kind of behavior, right? And it's like, obviously not. Joker is a villain. This is a villain origin story. There are no good guys in this story. Everyone is kind of awful, which Arthur points out at the end of the movie. So the media left with really, they were expecting some kind of an incel narrative that they could push. And I think what happened is instead they kind of got an attack on their own side of things, right? So in the film, you see a lot of protesters and everything like that. Incels don't get together. Incels don't protest. Those folks are loners by definition. I mean, they just lurk 4chan and 8chan and whatnot. So, but there are protesters in this. And the protesters in this are all wearing clown masks once the movement gets going, which is very reminiscent of V for Vendetta and the folks wearing the Guy Fawkes masks, which, of course, in a weird trick of fate, became, in real life. We started seeing Anonymous and wearing these kind of, Guy Fawkes masks and stuff like that. Well, the protesters are protesting because Thomas Wayne, at one point in the movie, he calls the citizens of Gotham that are kind of the underclasses, the poor and whatnot, he calls them clowns. And so that's where the whole thing starts, and they start wearing clown masks, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting is if you look at the signs that they're carrying, and they're out there protesting wealth inequality. Now, who does that in our real world of 2019? It's not incels, right? And then they're carrying signs that say, Wayne is a fascist, and resist. Now, who does that sound like? Who wears masks and carries these signs like that? It sounds like Antifa. So I think that the media went in hard expecting to have these points to go, aha, we've got you on this and we can scold you into oblivion. And instead, their ammunition got taken away from them because they wind up pointing their fingers at themselves, at who's mostly on Twitter practicing cancel culture and doing all this nonsense, right? Being constantly offended, monetizing outrage. It's not the incels. So without defending the incels, it's like, this is not an incel movie. So what the media was left to do was basically start a hysteria campaign. They're going to use fear to keep people out of the theaters. And we heard story after story about, oh man, the military is even expecting some violence, and they've put out a safety brief that says that people should look for double exits and be cautious. Don't go see Joker on the opening weekend because it's going to be terrible, et cetera, et cetera. Tonight, my local town company or news company, KRDO, ran a story on their page that is so insane. And it was basically just like in some theater in New York, some guy started laughing at inappropriate moments in the film, and people were so frightened that they got up and left and left the movie theater prematurely because this guy was so disturbing. In that very same story, they talked to the guy who was sitting right next to him, and he says the guy was drunk, that he poured like a whole flask into his Coke and was just hammered. And it's just a drunk guy, but they're covering this like it's an actual event because it's almost like the media wants something to happen so that they can kind of come out and say, see, we told you, you're not supposed to tell these kinds of stories. Right? They're looking for something or someone to blame. And unfortunately for this film, it is kind of the perfect scapegoat movie. And the reason I say that, and I call it that, is that whenever there's like some incident, mass shooting or something like that, the folks want to blame everybody but the individuals that committed it. So after Columbine shooting in Colorado, because the shooters were wearing trench coats, they pointed at the Matrix, right? They said, oh, it's the Matrix that's responsible. Not that these two nihilist jerks were completely into murdering people. You know what I mean? It's always something else. So they look for something to blame. Most recently, after the Texas shootings and the ones that happened in Dayton, it was video games, right? They're never going to talk about the actual motivations or anything like that. And if something does happen in the next couple of days, you can bet that the media is immediately going to pin it on Joker. That's absolutely going to happen. So it's regrettable. But what's interesting too is that the film ultimately, if I was going to put it on a political spectrum and had to pick a side, because I think it's not really a political film, but it definitely leans left. And the reason I say that is because the causes that it shows in the film, like what happens when government funds are cut, how mental illness affects people, those are kind of like left talking points, you know? The way Thomas Wayne talks is he's definitely more on the right, and he doesn't come across as a very nice person remotely. And especially he has a talking point where he's giving an interview, and he says something along the lines like, you know, people who have like they'll always resent people like me and people who have made something of their lives. And then he says, until they change, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, until they change, people like me who are successful or whatever will always regard those people as clowns. And that's where that whole thing comes from. And that's what starts the movement. So, and I'm kind of glad that they didn't just go, because initially I heard that Alec Baldwin was supposed to play Thomas Wayne, and they were really going for kind of a Trump caricature. And I'm really glad they didn't do that, because now this movie can stand separate from the current timeline that we're in, right? And so 10 years from now, regardless of whoever's in office, you can watch this film and not have these kind of like Trumpian, you know, memes and ideas tossed in your face. So that's just something I thought was interesting. Additionally, one of the things I really thought, and we've talked about it a little bit already, was that, you know, LA, if you combine LA, San Francisco, New York, and the crime of Chicago, you get Gotham. So Gotham is this kind of hyperbolic city, taking all these problems that are actually current in present day and dialing them up to 11, and then just throwing them out there and seeing how people who have to operate in this city in that kind of environment would deal with it, right? So, and it's not good. it's not good. That's not really a spoiler, but when you have kind of a powder keg like that, something's going to go down and it's not going to be good. So those observations aside on like the media treatment of this, which is really unfair, and Todd Phillips has really pointed this out, how they targeted the film, and they're like, you know, a lot of the critics are coming out and just saying, oh yeah, you know, it's not worth your time. It's this and this and this. And I can't agree with that. I consider myself a cinephile, and I've not seen a whole lot of movies like this. I can say that I can't say I've never seen another movie like this, because I have, right? But it's very rare. It's not a common occurrence that a movie like this even comes out and gets made. It's almost like this movie shouldn't exist, and I'm really surprised that Warner Brothers like went with it, because having seen the movie, and I was going to talk about this later, but this is a good segue. Warner Brothers has kind of a big problem with this movie, and the reason I say that is not because the film is controversial or anything like that, but before the film, they showed a trailer for Birds of Prey. And that's a Harley Quinn, the Emancipation of Harley Quinn. And it's like Harley and a bunch of like other women characters from the DC. Huntress is the only one I recognized. As I said before, I don't follow DC closely, but I recognized Huntress. So it's like Harley Quinn and Huntress and a bunch of other kind of like female badasses are running around Gotham doing their thing, right? And it looked pretty good. I was just like, okay, it had a little bit of Suicide Squad kind of feel to it, which I didn't really care for that movie, but I really like Harley. So I was just like, yeah, I'm down for this and everything. And then I saw Joker immediately after. You know, that was like the last trailer they showed, and then Joker showed. I don't see how I would be able to go see that Birds of Prey movie and take it seriously at all. Like, and And as for I feel really bad for Jared Leto because he's worked on his whole his interpretation of the Joker. Well, it's so blown out of the water that I'm just yeah, your interpretation of the Joker just doesn't do it for me. I'm sorry, man. And I don't know how Warner Brothers is going to address that, because this is supposed to be a standalone film. It's not supposed to have a sequel. To be honest, I don't know how they would do a sequel of this. I'm sure they could find a way and everything. They'd have to fast forward to include Batman. In the film, Bruce is, I don't know, maybe 12 at the oldest when they show him. But anyway, as much as I would like to see more Joaquin Phoenix as the Joker, I don't think we're going to get that, just because this is kind of a standalone. It's kind of its own thing in a way that's refreshing, because they don't have to tie it to a bunch of continuity. But man, I kind of want to see Todd Phillips' vision for Batman. You know what I mean? Because if Joker is like this, then I really want to see his kind of version of Batman Begins, right? And I just don't think that can happen, just for a number of different reasons. So I'm just going to kind of break into some theories and observations and other observations. I'm trying to keep this QFD to an hour, but there's so much to talk about and so much to discuss. I could probably talk about this movie for a day, nonstop. There's so much to cover. One of the big things about this is that a lot of this movie is not real. And this is one of the best examples of a literary technique called the unreliable narrator. And it's not just literary, it's a storytelling technique called the unreliable narrator. And there's two different kinds of unreliable narrators. There's the intentional unreliable narrator, which is the folks that are part of they're part of the story, and they're trying to obfuscate their guilt, usually for a reveal that's going to, be a twist or something. Like Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart is a good example of that. Gone Girl is a really good example. Life of Pi, as he's telling the story, you're starting to figure out that maybe this is not exactly what happened, right? And a movie that I'm pretty sure influenced Joker, Alex from A Clockwork Orange, is an unreliable narrator. He's from his point of view, he kind of has never done anything wrong. It's never his fault. It's just the way things are, right? The other way that somebody can be an unreliable narrator is unintentionally, right? Because they don't know all the facts. They don't have all the facts. They don't know everything that's going on. And they may not actually understand everything that they're doing. And the classic example of this is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, right? In To Kill a Mockingbird, the same thing with Scout, where, she's telling parts of the story but doesn't fully understand the ramifications of what she's seeing or what's going on. She's just kind of reporting what she saw, but she can't really interpret it in a realistic manner. And so it's left up to the reader to interpret what Scout is telling you. And those are a couple of examples of the unreliable narrator. And Joker is absolutely an unreliable narrator because you're seeing everything from his point of view. You're with Joker from the beginning of the movie to the last frame, right? From the first frame to the last frame. It doesn't really cut away to show other characters discussing things without him being present. He's always there. So everything is kind of filtered through the Arthur Fleck's lens. And Arthur has a, to be kind, dubious grasp on reality. So what you see oftentimes in the film is not happening, or only part of it is happening. And what's interesting is that this happens also in Taxi Driver, in King of Comedy, and of course in Fight Club, right? So, one of the telltale signs is when he's meeting with his I think it's the first meeting with his social worker / psychiatrist or whatever, and she asks him, "Do you remember why you were in the hospital?" Right? Because so apparently he was committed before, and he doesn't remember why, but we can infer that he's got some kind of a history of violence, because later on when he's talking to one of the clerks at Arkham, he says, "How does somebody get in here?" Well, it seems like he would have been in there already, right? Arkham State Hospitals, I think what they call it in the film instead of Arkham Asylum. But he would have been there, but it's almost like he doesn't remember. And he says, like, what does it take for somebody to get in here? Would you have to have committed a crime? And the clerk answers, yeah, some people have committed a crime. Others are a danger to themselves and to others, right? So if Arthur was committed, it was because he was a danger to himself and to others. There's a scene that's very brief where he discovers a letter that his mom has written. And the contents of that letter, we're going to discuss a little bit later, are really disturbing to him. Well, his mother doesn't try to stay in the room and talk to him. She locks herself in the bathroom, and she's scared. And the very first thing she says is, "You're going to kill me." Right? And I'm not speaking to you until you calm down. So his mom is somewhat afraid of him when he gets into some certain moods. So we know he has kind of a history of violence. There's a couple of different things there that kind of don't add up at different parts of the movie, and some the movie chooses to reveal very obviously. So you remember he meets Sophie, who is played by Zazie Beetz in the film. So he meets her in the elevator, kind of responds to her in a way that's not socially appropriate, and we actually see that a lot. Arthur is somebody who's trying to navigate society, and he doesn't always do things correctly. There's a scene where he's in a comedy club, and it's almost as if he knows he's in a comedy club, so he's supposed to laugh. But he's laughing at all the setups from the comedian, not the actual punchlines. He's laughing at the wrong time. But it's almost like he's trying to pantomime behavior that he sees because he doesn't know how to behave. And so when Sophie or Sophia, I'm actually not sure if they ever actually say her name. So, when she kind of makes a gun to the head kind of motion and mimics kind of shooting herself, and he does the same thing as she's walking to her apartment, but when he does it, it's like really creepy and it sets her off, right? But then later they're dating, right? And he's dating her and they're going out and everything. And so in a very obvious tip of the hat to Fight Club, at a certain point he goes into her apartment. And when he goes in there, she comes out, she sees him, and instead of just being like, "Oh, hey, you're the guy I've been dating for a couple of weeks," she doesn't know him. She's just like, "You're the guy from down the hall. Is your name Arthur? You live with your mom?" Like, she very much doesn't know him. And then in a very, a Fight Club-esque kind of clip montage, they show that every time he had been out on a date, he was actually alone. And so there was no relationship, and a lot of people will point to that as that being, whoa, that's incel stuff, right? And it could be that these, that somebody is obsessing on a woman and stalking her, because he does do that. But that just goes to show in this context, things that are not real, right? And so they deliberately show you that, hey, he was not dating Sophie. That was all in his head, I think, as a way to open the floodgates so that you start to question what exactly is real in this. And I kind of have a theory on this on my own. I think most of the time that Arthur is articulate, it isn't real. Most of the time, with the exception of the ending when he's on the talk show. I think that definitely happened, But a lot of the other times, when he's at the comedy club telling the jokes, we can hear the audience laughing in response, and it breaks into this kind of it breaks into a song, right? Smile, I think is the name of the song. But later on, when that clip is shown on the talk show, there is no audience reaction at all. So we know that part of that, and we actually see Sophia in the audience at the comedy club. So we know part of that was not real. There's some other parts when he gets fired and he comes back into the room, and one of the guys is trying to ask him questions and talk to him, and he honks his like clown horn in the guy's face, and then he comes back in and he says, "Oh, I forgot to punch out," and he punches the kind of time card clock until it comes off the wall. I don't think that happened. I think these are incidents that smack of, man, this is what I should have said, that we've all experienced, right? You get into a confrontation, or you get into something and you get into an argument, and then, as you're driving home or you get home and you're washing the dishes or something, you're replaying the conversation in your head and you're like, man, I should have totally said this and it would have been the best zinger ever. I think that's what's going on, is that these are inside Arthur's heads. They're what he should have said, or what he wished he could have said, or what he's saying. And one of the best examples I can think of is the second time he sees his therapist. And the second time he sees his therapist, he says a really, really important line. He says, like, my entire life, I didn't think I even existed, right? If you say that to like a psychiatrist or social worker, that should probably elicit a pretty strong reaction. And it kind of gets nothing from her. And then he goes, "You don't even listen, do you?" Right? And then he says, "I just told you that my entire life, I didn't even think I existed. And people just looked over me, but now they're starting to notice." And she kind of just says, "Hey, our funding's been cut. This is your last visit," etc. Right? And I think it goes beyond her not listening. I think he wasn't talking. I think all that was in his head, that he imagined, this is what I'm going to tell the therapist, or this is what I should have told the therapist, or this is what I'm rehearsing to tell the therapist. And when you see the way that Joaquin plays it, when he's Arthur Fleck trying to talk to people, he doesn't speak articulately at all. He hardly says a word. But then when he's with imaginary Sophia, he's very articulate. He talks up a storm. So whenever you see him talking up a storm, I think that's probably not real. There are definite moments, and the same thing kind of happens in Taxi Driver. Certainly in the end of Taxi Driver is completely in Travis Bickle's head. In The King of Comedy, the guy goes through these wild delusions of like daydreams, kind of, right? And he has, what's interesting in The King of Comedy is he has like a set of the talk show that he's obsessed with, like mocked up in his house. And he kind of rehearses running the talk show himself. And we actually see Joaquin like practicing, Joker practicing one of the few plans that he has. And it doesn't go off the way he had planned it, but we see him practicing it, like walking through a curtain and practicing his entrance and shaking hands and how he should sit on the couch when he's talking to Murray, the host of the talk show. We see all that, and that's very reminiscent of some of the stuff in The King of Comedy, which also brings me kind of to the end of this film. So after the incident at the talk show, right, where Joker is fully Joker at this point, he gets arrested and he's being, driven out through this whole riot because it's just kind of set the city aflame. There was this huge protest that was going to go on. Cops got beaten to a pulp. A guy was killed. All this stuff happened, and now that Joker has killed Murray on live TV, they are, the whole city is just burning. It's going up in flames and everything like that. And one of the moments that I could see why people would say this is a dangerous film is that he is in the cop car and he's laughing, right? Because he suffers, well, initially he suffers from this condition where he laughs uncontrollably regardless of his emotions. And that is an actual condition, and it is called pseudobulbar effect, or PBA. And I had to look that up because I didn't really know. But once he becomes the Joker, and when he normally does that laugh, it sounds very, very painful because it sounds like he's trying to hold it in, right? But when he becomes the Joker, he's not holding it in anymore. So he's like sitting there laughing. The cop goes, hey, you think this is funny or whatever? The whole city's burning because of what you did. And he answers, I know. Isn't it beautiful? And then he's kind of pseudo-rescued. An ambulance that's driven by one of the clown activists slams into the police car that's carrying him, and they pull him out of the car and they put him on the hood, and he rises up and starts doing this weird Joker dance that he does all the time, and to the adulation of the crowd. I don't think any of that happened. So I think after he shot Murray, he was arrested. I think that's what happened. And then they took him to Arkham State Hospital. and none of this other stuff kind of happened because it's like he's in this very horrendous crash, and it's like fatal to everybody involved, except the guy who was driving the ambulance, actually, and him. And so, and the fact that he comes out and he's kind of just fine, right? That he can stand on, he's bleeding, but he's okay. No broken limbs, nothing. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was handcuffed in the back of the car, and it's just like now he's fine and he's dancing on the hood. I'm like, none of that's real. That's all in his head. And it lines up with the end of Taxi Driver, because at the end of Taxi Driver, he's kind of, Travis is hailed as a hero or seen as a hero, et cetera, et cetera. So I could kind of see how some people would go, oh, this is how people are going to view themselves. They're going to view themselves as like a hero if they commit some atrocity, and it's going to be because of the Joker kind of taught him that. But I think it's really obvious that it's like, you don't want to be the Joker, right? You don't want to be out there doing these kinds of things. He's not a hero. He's not someone to aspire to, and neither is his behavior. Which takes me to another big question for the movie, right? Is who is Joker's father, right? And you would think that doesn't matter, right? But it does play quite heavily in the film. And my personal theory is that Thomas Wayne is actually his father. And here's my rationale for it. I'm going to lay it out. So, in the film, he discovers that Thomas Wayne might be his father because his mother has written a letter to Thomas Wayne to help her and her son, implying Arthur, right? So Arthur buys this story. Of course, he interrogates his mom about it. She tells him everything and says that she had to sign some non-disclosure agreements, and that's why she's kept it secret all this time. But now they're in dire straits financially, and Thomas Wayne, because he has such a great heart and everything, will help them out. So he goes and actually speaks to Alfred, right? He goes and sees Bruce, speaks to Alfred, and Alfred tells him, hey, your mom was delusional, right? None of that happened. Like, you're not Thomas Wayne's kid. This is all like just a made up thing, right? So the hole in my theory is that Alfred has no reason to lie. And the way that when he says, I'm Thomas Wayne's son, the way Alfred laughs at him is cruel, but it doesn't smack of somebody who's in on some kind of cover-up, right? However, my answer to that is that Alfred could have been hired way after the fact, because I don't think he ever answers the question when Arthur asks him, hey, my mother used to work here, did you know her? I don't think Alfred ever answers that. Kind of need to see the movie again to see if he does or not. But yeah, Alfred tells him that he's not. Then Arthur goes and he infiltrates this kind of Wayne gala that's going on, and he confronts Thomas Wayne in the bathroom and tells him, hey, you're my dad, and I know everything. My mom told me everything. And Thomas Wayne tells him, oh, you're the guy who came to the house yesterday. And he's like, your mother was delusional. She suffered from all these disorders. You're adopted, right? And you're not my kid. I don't want anything to do with you. And if you ever come around again, I'm going to kill you, etc. Right? So, and then Thomas punches him in the face. So he's kind of left as to who to believe, right? And he wants to believe his mother, but he decides that he's going to go to Arkham State Hospital and check out the records for himself. And it turns out that it looks like Thomas Wayne was telling the truth. His mother was admitted for all these different conditions, and they actually have like adoption papers, like requests for adoption in her files at Arkham State Hospital, which seemed a little weird to me. But you know, if you're cutting the screenwriter a couple of a little slack, you're like, well, I don't want another scene where Arthur now has to go down to City Hall and dig up 30-year-old adoption papers. So it's okay to just throw them in there, right? And throw them in the folder with her medical file. So he kind of sees a vision. It's a really cool story technique. It's not really a vision, but he's imagining as he's reading this folder that has all this information about his mother's condition and her obsession with Thomas Wayne. They kind of act it out, right? And one of the things I thought was really interesting about that scene is that his young mother, when they show her, if I had walked into that movie cold and not known anything of what I was seeing on that screen, just knowing that it was a DC movie, and I walk in and I see this young woman being kind of interrogated about Thomas Wayne, right, and what's going on, I would have guessed it was Harley Quinn, not Joker's mom. And I got a very big Harley Quinn vibe from it. And I was like, you know, this, if that's what they were going for, I don't know if that's what they were going for or not. It really does kind of explain why Joker and Harley's relationship is that jacked up. So, but anyway, jumping back to this, his mother tells the people, because they're like, oh, you adopted this kid, right? And she says, no, that's something Thomas Wayne had drawn up so that people would not know about us, right? That it was a cover-up. And I think she's right. And the only evidence I have for this is all circumstantial. And it stems from right before Arthur kind of becomes Joker. He's painting his face white. And one of the things that happens is that he looks down at the adoption paperwork and it says name of child unknown. So at that point, he doesn't even know who he is. He's not Arthur. He's not Carnival. I think that was his clown persona. And he's not Arthur Fleck, and he's not Arthur Wayne. He has no identity left. He's a blank slate. He's just completely empty. And I think through cinematic use, that scene, he's actually painting his face white, like a blank slate. And even though it is kind of the base for clown makeup, it is the base. It is the blank canvas you put on first before you start painting it, right? So I thought that was some interesting symbolism. But he's holding a photograph of his mother as a young woman, and she's standing on what looks like Wayne Manor or Wayne Estates or something. And on the back, there's a handwritten note that says, I love your smile, TW. So it is possible that Thomas Wayne just had the photograph of his house staff, and he wrote a personal note on the back of it, and she took that and became completely obsessed that Thomas Wayne and her were having an affair. But I was thinking about it, and I'm like, she mentions several times that she was an employee of Thomas Wayne 30 years ago, right? That it was 30 years before. And so we know the movie takes place in 1981. So 30 years before that, I don't think they're going to let a single woman with all kinds of personality disorders adopt a kid. And that's why I think Thomas Wayne is actually Arthur's dad, and that the whole thing is a cover-up, and that Penny is in fact telling the truth, at least about that, about the adoption paperwork. And it could be possible that she had a kid with her boyfriend that was really abusive, and then just kind of, because he was so abusive, said that, oh well, you know, I'm gonna imagine that Thomas Wayne is his father instead of this jerk that's been abusing us, right? Except that, why would Thomas Wayne know about the adoption papers then, right? So I think Thomas Wayne comes out of this movie a much worse figure than he is in any other Batman movie. So there is that anyway. But yeah, so in that scene, kind of Joker is all that's left. And I'm reminded about something, and I do kind of need to see the movie again to confirm this. But I think one of the things that they did is, we know that when he kind of inherits the Joker personality, he does these like weird dance moves. They're like these slow-mo, almost like a kata kind of move. And there's a scene where he's writing in his journal, where he's writing a scene, and he says it's supposed to be kind of a joke, but it's more of an observation. And it starts off with the strange thing, or the funny thing about mental illness is that people expect you to behave as if you don't have it, right? But he's only written the first part of that. And he kind of stops, puts the pen down, takes a puff of his cigarette, and then his left arm, does that weird kind of Joker movement, right? And then picks up the pen and he starts writing left-handed, and he writes the end of it, right? And I was just wondering, I was like, did that actually happen, or am I seeing something? You know, am I seeing too much into this, or is Joker left-handed? And that's how you can tell when he's kind of just becoming more and more Joker. So that was just some observation. I need to keep my eyes open. One of the other things I want to talk about is an incident from real life that the movie draws a lot of inspiration from. And those of you who are not around in the 80s, especially not around in New York in the mid 80s, probably don't know anything about this. But in 1984, there was actually a subway shooting that's very close to what happened in the movie, except there were not Wall Street executives. So as a reminder, in the film, these three kind of Wall Street executives come down into the subway. They're hammered drunk. They're talking about how one of the guys struck out with a woman. It is kind of meant to be an indictment of bro/frat culture. They start harassing a woman who's just sitting on the train reading a book. She kind of looks to Arthur for help, but Arthur is in no position to help her. He is having one of his laughing fit attacks. And so he just starts laughing. She's able to actually leave the car, and they turn their attention to Arthur. And they essentially start harassing him. They beat the crap out of him. And halfway through the beating, Arthur has gotten a gun because he's been beaten before. And he pulls the gun and shoots in self-defense. The first couple of shots, anyway, are in self-defense. But then his blood's up. And the third guy is only wounded, right? And has gotten away. And is running away and trying to get away in the subway station. And Arthur, who is very much in Joker mode now, just stalks the guy and shoots him down in cold blood. And that's kind of the start of the whole clown movement thing, because when Thomas Wayne is actually being asked a question about the subway murders, when he makes that statement about people being viewed as clowns because they think that whoever the subway vigilante was wearing a clown mask. Well, in 1984 in New York, there was a guy named Bernard Goetz, and He boarded a subway, and there were a bunch of people on the car, but there were 4 black youths on there, and they may have been like young men. They may have been like over 18. But there's a lot of controversy on what went down. Apparently, they asked him or demanded that he give them money, and he drew a revolver and emptied it into all 4 of them. And I don't remember, I know one of them was paralyzed. I don't remember if he killed any of them right then, but he essentially escaped the subway after that happened, went in hiding, and then wound up turning himself in because he didn't want to be on the run. And there are some serious parallels between his story and what happens with Arthur. So in 1981, Getz had been attacked before in a subway station. He got jumped by 3 young guys. They beat him up. They threw him through a plate glass window, all kinds of stuff. And he went and tried to get a gun. Now in New York City, it's almost impossible to get kind of like a carry permit. So he was not allowed to do that, and he carried it illegally. So that's where he had the gun from, and his experience with the mugging, right? So he thought he was getting mugged again. And if you want to do research on this whole case, there's various, there's a bunch of different versions of who to believe and what actually went down and everything. But that kind of explains his state of mind, at least, that he thought he was being kind of mugged again, drew this gun and kind of attacked these guys. And whether it was like justified or not, that was part of the big case that went on. Now in 84, this case just dominated all of New York City, all of New York, actually. And at least New York. I was living in New York at the time, so I can only speak to that. But it was kind of insane because he was very much viewed as a hero. And they called it the Subway Vigilante. And if I'm not mistaken, he used to like run like an electronics repair store or whatever. Years after the fact, he renamed his company like Vigilante Electronics or something. So he was very much viewed as a hero. People were like raising money for his defense, for his legal defense. Later on, like I want to say 2 or 3 years later, he wound up running for mayor of New York. Right. It was very unsuccessful, but he did wind up running for mayor, and he kind of embraced the celebrity of it. Whether or not it was to his advantage or detriment, you need to go look into the case yourself. But that very much, I would be really, really surprised if Todd Phillips did not use this whole Bernard Getz storyline to influence the events in The Joker, because we're seeing exactly the same thing. He gets jumped at the beginning of the movie. He acquires a gun. Then when he's jumped again on the subway, he retaliates with the gun, executes these guys, and he is very much viewed as a hero to this whole movement. Now, granted, the whole Bernard Getz thing, he didn't start a movement, but like at the time with New York City, it was high crime at that time, and people were really, really sick of it. So they viewed him as kind of a figurehead of, yeah, this is what should happen, right? Because our streets are not safe. So it's just an interesting side note that this Bernard Getz thing, on top of like Taxi Driver and King of Comedy and Fight Club, that's also, it's got to be one of the key influences. And, I also want to take a moment, and I'm going to butcher her name, and talk about the score of this film. And it is by Hildur Gudnadottir, and I know I'm saying that wrong. She's Icelandic. The score is absolutely incredible. There were actually moments of the movie where I wished the music would stop, because it was almost like I was on the edge of my seat, and I was already dialed up to 11, and there was nowhere I could go. And the music's like, no, I'm going to drive you to 12, right? And I'm just like, dude, I need a break. So, and I love her stuff. It's really, really edgy. She also did the score for the HBO series Chernobyl, which if you haven't seen that, you absolute must watch. You absolutely need to see that. So that I did want to take a moment to talk about that. And also, it looks like Warner Brothers may be launching, because of the reception of the Joker so far, may be launching an imprint called DC Black. I think that's what it's called, or DC Dark, or something, where they're going to be doing more kind of like one-shot, almost R-rated versions, more serious films, without a lot of the spectacle we've come to expect from, say, a comic book movie. And that's probably a good idea, because the genre, I can't imagine the genre has a whole lot of legs left. Not after Endgame, right? That was like the big culminating thing. I mean, I could be completely wrong. Marvel may have something up their sleeves. DC may have something up their sleeves. But then again, you know, who knows? I think the genre is probably on the downturn. But then again, something like Joker comes along, and you're like, wow, this is an entirely different way that we can tell comic book movies and keep them relevant to things that are going on now. And this film is particularly relevant to 2019, specifically the things that the Joker says on the talk show when he's being interviewed. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that Joker takes on a very weird, almost a dialect when he's on the talk show. It's a little bit fancier. It's a little bit kind of almost effeminate. You can really catch it when he says the word Murray. Earlier on, when he's like, hey, one more thing, Murray, can you introduce me as Joker? He says it very normally. But then when he's on the show, under the spotlights, and he's kind of like smiling at everyone and just basking and taking in all the attention that he's getting, he keeps saying Murray like that. And the way he talks, when he confesses to killing the Wall Street guys on the train, it doesn't sound normal. It sounds really different. And it's a cool affectation that he says, and he says a really important line. When he talks about killing the men on the subway, the audience reacts and they start booing. And he answers back, come on, if it was me lying on the floor, you'd step right over me. And it's true. It's like there are these people that fall through the cracks of society and nobody cares about them. Right. And they wouldn't even notice that they're dead. And every so often you hear these stories show up about, some homeless person. It looks like there's a homeless person there, but it's actually a corpse. Like that person's been dead for 2 days and no one noticed. No one cared. Right. And that's kind of the themes that show up at the end, is that and it's almost like Todd Phillips is speaking through the Joker, because he says certain things that are very targeted towards our culture in 2019 and don't have a whole lot to do with 1981. One, he says people can't be civil. You can't have a civil discussion anymore. I think he almost actually flat out says that word for word. I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember, but it's something very along those lines. And then when he tells an off-color joke, an off-color knock-knock joke, he gets scolded immediately. That's not funny. You can't tell jokes like that, right? And later on in that conversation, he says comedy is subjective, right? And he doesn't say this part. I'm paraphrasing. He says something along the lines of like, you're not allowed to tell me what's funny or not. That's the intent of the words that he's saying or whatever. And of course, it all leads up to the big end statement that he says, his new joke is, something along the lines of, what do you get when you cross a mentally ill person with a society that treats them like trash? And there's a lot of shouting over him and we're done with you and all this stuff. And then he pulls his gun and he says, you get what you effing deserve. Right. And shoots Murray on live television. So it is very impactful. That is definitely what the film is about. I mean, I don't see how they could spell out a theme more dramatically or more obviously. This is not a movie that obfuscates its theme. It obfuscates a lot of other stuff, like how much of the film is actually real, how much is actually going on, and how much is in his head. And people will be discussing that for until Todd Phillips comes out and says definitively this is what was going on in his head. But it's interesting, again, to kind of bring it back full circle, that how relevant this movie is in 2019, that the concern trolling of the media, of the movie critics and stuff coming out going, well, what kind of ideas are we trying to push? This is a dangerous movie. This is unsafe. This is scary. This is not the kind of thing that we want to push out in a society. And in a certain way, they're right, because Joker is a cautionary tale. They've taken the things that are going on, dialed them up to 11, and showed us what could happen. And events like this are already happening, and they're politically motivated. It's only the beginning. So it's like you have a chance to dial things back, to be more civil, to fix things, to care about people. But if you're just going to cancel the movie because it's talking about things that make you uncomfortable, well, then you're not getting the point. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.